I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction to the Avoid programme. It's born out of a recognition that we have an overall political objective in the Climate Change Convention, which was agreed in 1992, which seems like an awfully long time away now. And that is to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And that's the bit that gets quoted most. The bit in black underneath is really a sort of explanation of what that should mean, and that is that the level to be achieved should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change and to ensure that food production is not threatened and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Now, I don't think that was a comprehensive list of requirements, but it would certainly give a sense of the concerns of the parties when they decided on that, and what Sir John has said is actually very relevant to that. Now, interestingly enough, although this is the objective of the convention, there hasn't actually been a lot of work focused on addressing the issues that that implies. And we have to go back to quite a while just before the Kyoto Protocol, when there's some Dutch work looking at this and looking at stabilisation levels. And in fact, the 2-degree target, which we'll hear much more about, and which has now since been agreed in the convention, was first proposed by the EU way back in 1996. But I have to say that the evidence base even then was probably quite thin, and we recognised that it was important to get a better sense of the rationale for levels and how you actually deal with them. And the UK actually, in its G8 presidency in 2005, hosted a conference in Exeter which addressed the issues which Avoid now addresses as a research programme. And that was the forerunner of that first look at what we decided were the key questions which scientifically we needed to address, but which were focused on a policy outcome. And the three questions are, well, what are the levels of climate change that are potentially dangerous? How do we define that? What are the issues that, what would different levels of climate change actually do for us? And do we consider these to be too much? What emission pathways will avoid dangerous climate change? So once we set a level, how do we actually achieve that in terms of emissions, which are driving the temperature upwards? And then specifically, what is the technical and economic feasibility of such pathways? And these are the questions that underline the research programme, which was initiated by DEC and DEFRA in 2009. So just say a few things about the research programme itself. It's multidisciplinary, so it covers people with expertise in economics, chemistry, biology, economics, and probably a host of other disciplines as well. The cost over 4 years is about $2.5 million, which sounds a lot, but then when I tell you how much was done in the programme, you begin to realise why. A consortium won the contract by tender and it was led by the Met Office Hadley Centre, consisting also of representatives from the Walker Institute, Tyndall Centre and the Grantham Institute, and they will be speaking to you very shortly. The interesting thing about Avoid, it was done in a sort of open access type of way. So although there was core work which was done within the programme, it was also flexible enough to co-opt researchers from other programmes, to draw on other programmes, so that in the end, about 120 researchers from over 40 institutions and organisations have been at one time or another involved in the programme. And so far there have been 26 peer-reviewed papers published or submitted, and I'm sure there's quite a few more. And there's quite a lot of unpublished reports as well, which probably around 40, I think, which are available. So today's presenters are Jason Lowe, and Jason is the Chief Scientist for the Avoid programme, and he's also Head of Knowledge Integration and Mitigation Advice at the Met Office, Hadley Centre. Professor Nigel Arnell is the Director of the Walker Institute of Climate Change Research and Professor of Climate in the Department of Meteorology at the University of Reading. Dr. Rachel Warren is a NERC Advanced Research Fellow at the Tyndall Centre and leads the Community Integrated Assessment System. And finally, Dr. Simon Buckle is Pro-Rector of International Affairs and Policy Director at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change at Imperial College. You'll probably see this a few times. This is the website. There's a huge amount of information, far more than you will hear today. So if you want to follow up on lots of the different types of projects that have been undertaken in Avoid, then please feel free to go to the website and follow that up. But now I'm going to call on Jason, Nigel, Rachel and Simon to speak to us over the next hour or so. And first of all, we're going to lead off with Jason now. This is a seamless presentation. I'm not going to introduce them again. They will all pop up and down. But first of all, let me call on Jason to start the ball rolling. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Avoid has been a very interesting programme to work on. And we've taken a very different approach. What we've tried to do in Avoid is recognise that actually there's a diverse amount of research already out there in the UK community. And we've tried to add something onto the top of that. We've tried to make it more relevant to the questions that policy colleagues are asking. What you're going to see today is going to be a snapshot of some of the most exciting pieces of research we've completed. As David said, there's something like 50 distinct projects we've covered over the 4-year period. So I'm going to start with an introduction, and then we'll have 4 talks that go through really a storyline of the 3 questions that David highlighted. My starting point is this word dangerous. The Framework Convention, it tells us we need to avoid dangerous climate change, but it doesn't really help us define what dangerous is. I've come to realise the more people I talk to, the more I find there's a different view of what dangerous means. So if you ask a climate scientist, I've picked an example one here, then chances are they would come up with something along the lines of, well, it perhaps relates to thresholds in the climate system, thresholds related to abrupt change or irreversible change. It might be, for instance, an accelerated loss of ice from the Greenland ice sheet, or a shutdown in the Atlantic overturning circulation, or a change in a major atmospheric regime, such as a shift in a monsoon circulation. If you ask an impact specialist, or many of the policy analysts, and I think there's probably quite a few in this room, then the focus will probably be more on the impacts on people, on infrastructure, and on natural systems. It's very likely as well that they'll try and tot up the cost of that and express the numbers as a fraction of GDP losses. Politicians try to really boil that down into something they can use for the process of negotiation, and so come up with targets such as a target on global average warming of limiting it to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, David told us a little bit about the history of that particular target proposed by the EU in 1996. There was a G8 communique in 2008 that indicated there was broad scientific support for that as a suitable target. And it eventually found its way formally into the United Nations Framework Convention process in 2010. But there certainly are lots of difficulties in setting a particular target. And it's why within Avoid, we've actually looked at a range of different temperature targets, trying to broaden the evidence base. When it comes to setting a target, there's quite a few things that we have to bear in mind. So firstly, when we're taking the climate science's view of large-scale changes in the climate system, actually, those are very uncertain. We've learned probably quite a lot about the physical processes behind many of these large-scale changes over the past few years. But I think the more we've learned about those processes, the more we've also learned it's incredibly difficult to come up with a particular probability of when they might be triggered. So it's very difficult to choose a single temperature. One thing you'll see from Nigel and Rachel's talks is how wide the uncertainty is when it comes to looking at the estimate of impacts on people and natural systems. Also, when we're thinking of temperature targets, we have to acknowledge that some parts of the world, for some amounts of climate change, will actually see some benefit. How do we factor that into the discussion? Not all of the impacts either are driven by global average temperature. Global average temperature it's a simple indicator. Actually, when we think of the types of impacts occurring, they're happening locally. Often they're driven by changes in rainfall. Often they're driven by changes in extremes. And the situation is more complex in that you can have, for instance, two pathways with the same temperature, but made up of different baskets of greenhouse gases, so different CO2 levels, with different amounts of impacts. So there's an awful lot hidden behind a global average temperature target. It doesn't take account of rate of change either. My final point is that climate change is already detectable. This was something Sir John highlighted in several of his slides. And what that means is if we choose a warming target of 1 degree or 1.5 or 2 degrees, whichever of those, then it's not going to avoid all of the impacts. There'll be a level of climate change that still has to be adapted to, or that society needs to be made resilient to. I also picked up on the point that Sir John picked up on, so it's reassuring to see we both come up with the example of the Texas heat wave. I'll probably stick to the other example here of the European temperatures in 2003. Summer temperatures reached the highest level since at least 1500. And one of the new exciting developments in climate science is this ability to try to estimate how the probability of this type of extreme season has been changed by anthropogenic activity. In the case of the European summer heatwave in 2003, then estimates suggest at least a doubling of that type of event has resulted from man's activity. If we take the same models and run them forward, then by the 2040s, the type of event we saw in 2003 will be likely to happen every other year. And as we approach the end of the century, we'd view that type of event as a particularly cool summer. Moving forward and looking at impacts, this is a slide that Nigel and Rachel put together. This is an attempt to look at a plausible future. So it's not an attempt to produce a central estimate projection or associated projection with a particular probability level. It's an attempt to take a plausible climate model and couple that to plausible impacts models. And it gives us a sense of the sort of numbers we might be looking at by the middle of the 21st century following a business as usual scenario. So on the left-hand side, you can see of the order of 1 billion people at risk of increased water scarcity, 1/3 of a billion at risk of increased river flooding. Even with the enhanced CO2 levels acting on fertilisation, spring wheat yield down almost 20%. Coastal flooding, perhaps 70,000 people per year extra flooded at the coastline as a result of sea level rise. We're also seeing potential large losses in various measures of biodiversity and increases in the demand for cooling. Of course, on the other side of the coin, there's a reduction in demand for heating. What I want to move on to now is, of the 50 or so pieces of work, is a snapshot of the key results. So Nigel and Rachel are going to go first, looking at some of the impacts. Then Simon and I will talk about some of the aspects of feasibility as to whether those pathways appear achievable. So with that, I'll hand over to Nigel.
Thank you, Jason. What I want to talk about are the impacts and consequences of climate change that are avoided by particular emissions pathways. And we built within the Avoid programme on a whole series of existing projects funded by NERC and other research councils. So to emphasise what David said, we really added value to other research programmes here. And what I want to do is provide some snapshot highlight results for a range of sectors, looking at, in the first instance, 3 different climate futures. One, a business as usual case where the temperature by the end of the century hits around 4 degrees. The blue line is this 2-degree pathway. What happens if we do manage to achieve a 2-degree target by the end of the century? And the green line is not quite as optimistic as that. It's of the order of 2.5, just over 2.5 degrees. And what I'm going to talk about is based on applying large-scale impacts models across a wide geographic domain, but I'm summarising and looking at the global summary results here. So by the end of the century, by 2100, the impacts of climate change are likely to be pretty substantial. Jason showed some figures for 2050. This is the end of the century. So around 1 billion people exposed to increased water stress, around 400 million people exposed to a doubling of flood frequency, and so on and so forth. If we were to achieve a 2-degree target, by the end of the century, we would have drawn those impacts down, varying across sectors. So the blue bars are the impacts we get under the 2-degree world, and the pale blue are the impacts that we've avoided by having the 2-degree world. So in terms of water resource stress and exposure, if we hit a 2-degree target, we'd have taken of the order of 200 million people out of increased exposure to drought. We'd have taken around 250 million people out of increased exposure to the flood hazard, and we'll have lowered the increase in cooling energy requirements from around 80% to closer to 35%. So a policy which achieves 2 degrees, we can see, has some really quite substantial impacts across a range of sectors. We lower the impacts on ocean acidity, for example. If we don't quite hit 2 degrees, but we hit 2.5 or just over 2.5, then we do still avoid some impacts, although not as many, obviously, as with the more stringent target. So the green bars here show the impacts under our 2.5 degree world, and the pale green are the impacts avoided relative to our 4-degree world again. So this time we take out about 150 million people from exposure to water stress, only about 60 million people out of exposure to increased river flood frequency, for example. Now, Jason's mentioned the uncertainty in projections of climate change. Those numbers that we saw there were based on a plausible description of a world. They're not a prediction of exactly what we think is going to happen. They're a plausible description from one climate model. We've repeated the analysis with a whole range of different climate models because the magnitude of impact depends very much on the spatial pattern of change, particularly in rainfall. Jason mentioned that many impacts were sensitive to rainfall change. But what we found in the first instance is if we express the impacts that we avoid as a proportion of the impacts that would happen without any climate policy, that proportion is relatively robust amongst the different climate models. So, for example, here, in terms of the benefits of reducing exposure to increased water stress, if you ignore the negatives and the double contradictions there, it's between 10 and 25% between different climate models of those impacts are avoided, of the order of 45 to 65% in terms of the increased exposure to flood risk. Very little uncertainty in the proportion of the increased in energy residential cooling demand are avoided. You might just be able to see it. It's still pretty consistent. And we can see the reduction in residential heating demand. That's one of the benefits of climate change that Jason mentioned. So the proportion of impacts avoided by climate policy is relatively robust. So we can be quite confident about saying what proportion of impacts we could save by a climate policy. But because the absolute amount of impacts vary depending on our projected pattern of rainfall change, the estimated absolute savings, if you like, from climate policy are way more uncertain. And this is obviously particularly important if we're trying to work out the cost and benefit of different strategies. So, for example, the range across the 7 models in the estimated impact on, avoided impact on residential cooling demand, well, there's not much range there. It's relatively robust. But in terms of wheat productivity or soybean productivity, the range in avoided benefits, or saved benefits, avoided impacts, is between 3 and 4, whereas the range in saved exposure to flooding is a factor of 24, a massive difference between the climate models. So although the proportion of impacts we save by climate policy are reasonably consistent, the absolute amount is much more uncertain. And one of the reasons is because there's a big geographic variation in exposure impact across regions, and the climate change has different consequences across regions. And a byproduct of that is that the impacts that we avoid by a particular climate policy also vary from region to region. So here we see exposure to increased flood frequency. across most of the world, it's of the order of 30 to 40% avoided by our 2-degree target policy. In some parts of the world, around the Arabian Peninsula, it doesn't really have much effect because a relatively small change there is sufficient to have a big consequence, whereas in other parts of the world where climate change only just tips them into the worst category, avoiding the lower emissions policy has a bigger impact on the impacts that you would expect. So, strong degree of geographic variability in the benefits of a given climate policy. Another key finding is that we've often looked at the benefits of climate change, of climate policy, at a particular time period. What are the impacts you save in 2050 or 2080 or 2100? We can look at it the other way around and say how much time is bought by reducing impacts. By how long do we delay impacts and consequences? And here we've got the trajectory of change in exposure to increased flood frequency under one plausible future through the 21st century. The red line is the 4-degree world, the blue line is the 2-degree world. And the impacts that we get in 2040 under business as usual would be delayed by of the order of 20 or 30 years, if we were to reduce emissions to hit the 2-degree pathway, or of the order of 10, 15 years if we were to be on the slower change trajectory. So mitigation not only reduces the impacts at a particular time period, but it also delays the impacts that we would otherwise expect, perhaps buying time for adaptation or indeed other sorts of response. Now, I've compared impacts so far with what we would get under a 4-degree world, but we know that emissions aren't necessarily going to follow that trajectory. There's every suggestion, as we'll see in a moment, that emissions actually are suggesting the unmitigated climate change will be greater than that. So we've also looked at what would happen under a higher rate of climate change, of the order of 5.5 degrees by the end of the century. These are the proportion of impacts that are avoided in the A1B world, that's the 4-degree world. So we can see of the order of 20% of the increased exposure to water stress, 40% in exposure to river flood frequency. If the unmitigated climate change were greater, then we'd see greater benefits. So the impacts avoided would be more. So that adds another level of complication in trying to estimate the benefits and the impacts avoided by climate change, because we don't really know what the counterfactual is going to be. Most of the numbers we've looked at so far have been, in some senses, on a relatively optimistic counterfactual, with only a 4-degree rise in temperature by the end of the century. If the world is heading on a bigger emissions trajectory, then we would expect the benefits to be saved by climate policy to be greater. But that's another factor that goes into the uncertainty. Now, what I want to do now is pass over to Rachel, who will be looking at one sector in more detail and then comparing the physical impacts with some of the economic impacts.
So I'm going to complement what Nigel's been saying about the impacts on human systems by talking about the impacts on natural systems. We mapped out the impacts of climate change on 50,000 species, and we plotted the areas that remain climatically suitable for plants under a 2-degree scenario. And these are the areas that remain suitable for 75% of the plants that are currently present. So all of that grey area is where we do not have that safety. If you look at 3.5 degrees, you can see that the areas where plants are, if you like, in a refuge from climate change, we call this a refugium, has shrunk quite dramatically. Conversely, we looked at areas where more than 75% of the plant species would be lost because the climate has become unsuitable in a 2 degrees scenario. So all of those coloured areas are what we call areas of concern for plants. And at 3.5 degrees, that grows dramatically. And you can see you have these very large hotspots in the Amazon, South Africa and Australia, and also around the Mediterranean. We looked at 5 different taxa. So here you can see birds, amphibians, plants and mammals. And we plotted out the increase in those areas of concern. Those are the red lines. And note that all of these Red lines are the SRES A1B scenario. So Nigel was explaining just now that that is actually rather a conservative projection now for business as usual. And that then under our 2 degree or our 2.5 degree pathway, we reduce the land area where climate becomes unsuitable in all of these taxa. Now, where there are areas of concern for plants, it means that there is a potential to lose a huge amount of carbon from those areas. And so we estimated the potential loss of carbon in the unmitigated scenario and the scenarios where we have a 2 or a 2.5 degree pathway. And we can see that there is significant risk of terrestrial carbon loss due to that impact on plants. So in another complementary study, we looked at the impacts of climate change on aggregate economic damages. And we used the Page model, a very similar version to the one that was used in the Stern Review. And we found that the aggregate global economic damages are very substantial, as indeed did the Stern Review. And we found that stringent mitigation can avoid a large proportion of the aggregate damages that would otherwise occur in the second half of the 21st century. In fact, we found that with our 2 degree pathway, that about half of the aggregate economic impacts could be avoided, but the 2.5 degree pathway avoids about 1/3 of them. And so you can see here, this is plotted as equity weighted impacts, and that these damages are running up as high as $35 trillion by the end of the century, and that is in the more conservative A1B baseline. So we have here a very interesting result that both the physically based models looking at human systems and natural systems and the economic analysis produces very similar findings. Now the Page model, when it is used to do cost-benefit analysis, recommends pretty strong levels of mitigation because it contains a lot of information about the uncertainties that we've been talking about in the climate system and in the estimation of impacts. You will see out there in the literature some outputs from other cost-benefit models that we did not use in our project. Those models tend to omit uncertainty analysis. They assume an optimal trade-off between mitigation and damages and sometimes adaptation, when in fact there isn't a single decision maker and there isn't a single budget holder. The evaluation of impacts is inevitably subjective because different impacts will matter more or less to different societal groups. The evaluation of those impacts depends on an uncertain discount rate, which many models choose a single value for. It depends on how you treat equity, and of course it depends on the climate sensitivity. So as soon as climate modelers change the value of climate sensitivity, models of that type would then come up with a new optimal. So this is really just to explain why you might see papers in the literature recommending values of optimal action on climate change that would recommend that we allow temperatures to rise to 3 degrees or higher. Now those will not have the very significant benefits that we're showing here. So the conclusion overall from the impact studies are that early stringent mitigation can avoid between 20 and 60% of the impacts that will otherwise occur by the end of the 21st century. And that varies according to which sector you're looking at and which region you're looking at. It applies to both physically modelled impacts on human systems, on natural systems, and on aggregate economic impacts. In all of these systems, the avoided impacts increase with time. Stringent mitigation buys decades for adaptation. That is, it postpones the time at which a certain level of climate change and therefore impacts is reached, and therefore there is longer to adapt to that level of change or that level of impacts. And delay in mitigation always reduces avoided impacts. So I'm now going to hand over to Simon, who is going to talk to us, to Jason, who is going to talk to us about feasibility.
Thanks, Rachel. So when we think about feasibility of achieving particular temperature levels, that feasibility is affected by several different things. It's affected by the constraints that the climate system places on it. So for a given climate pathway, there's actually a window of emission pathways that's determined by how the climate system works. And we can express in terms of quantities like climate sensitivity and the strength of various biogeochemical feedbacks. I'm going to concentrate on that. And then Simon will come up and he'll talk about two other aspects of feasibility related to technical and economic changes. So what do we do? Starting from a baseline, in this case we focused on SRES A1B, we constructed a range of policy emission scenarios. They kind of look like this. Oops. Go back a bit. The policy emission scenarios, they have a variation in quantities such as the year at which we peak emissions or the long-term reduction rate in emissions. We've also looked at this quantity, these are called negative emission sources. Now here, we're thinking about enhanced removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So take a particular example, a scheme known as BECCS. Here, you would take biofuels, but you would burn that in carbon capture and storage facilities. Now, this is a thought experiment. In reality, it's not clear that the technology around carbon capture and storage could be scaled up to the sorts of levels we're looking at here. And there are issues over the capacity for biofuels. But we're coming at this question really from a top down. What would you need to do to get to a particular temperature level? In this case, we've used a simple climate model. That's because the number of model years we've simulated works out at something like 50 billion years. When we look across the Avoid programme as a whole, we've used a range of different models, going from the much more advanced HADGEM family of models through the types of models used in the last IPCC analysis to simple climate models. But where we use the simple climate models, we make them traceable to the more complex understanding of the climate system. That way, they let us interpolate between the more limited number of simulations we can run with the most complex models. Sampling uncertainty is absolutely critical because the statements we make around achieving a particular temperature level, they have to be associated with a probability. It's not meaningful to say we will achieve 2 degrees. It is meaningful to say, can we achieve 2 degrees with a 50% probability or a 66% probability? The results I'm going to show focus on the 50% probability level, but just as a way of orientating, a 66% probability level of achieving 2 degrees corresponds roughly to a 50% chance of achieving around 1.75 degrees. So we produced a lot of these types of plots. The vertical axis, this represents the long-term reduction rate in emissions after the peak in emissions. The horizontal axis, that's the peak year of emissions, and the colours, they show the cumulative amount of negative emissions. The blue has no negative emission sources. And each of those points represents a solution that gives a 50% probability of limiting warming to no more than 2 degrees up to 2100. Now we can add some extra lines on this based on literature values. So here the horizontal red line, this comes from looking in particular at the integrated assessment modelling literature. And when you consult this literature, there's a view that long-term reduction rates that go much beyond 3 or 4% per year are very difficult to sustain. There's some literature starting to appear that challenges that, but still the majority of this type of models tends to come out with a decrease no more than 3.5% per year. So I've selected that for this example. And I've also put this diagonal line on that separates the negative emission sources from not having negative emission sources. This is the flexibility we're looking at to achieve 2 degrees with 50% probability without negative emissions. So if we just read a value off that, you can see with a reduction rate of 3% per year, no negative emissions, that's suggesting a need to peak the emissions around 2015. Negative emissions, well, the maximum amount we've assumed comes from 2 sources, but you end up with very similar numbers. If you look at the full range from available IAMs, you get a number. You get a similar number if you take the amount of land available for biofuels estimated by the Committee on Climate Change and combine that with the BECS efficiency that DEC calculated. You come up with very similar numbers. So if you take the maximum estimates of negative emissions we used in this study, again with the 3% per year reduction rate, now we're looking at a peak year for emissions that's around 2023, the middle of the 2020s. But certainly if we were getting the negative emissions from this idea of biofuels combined with carbon capture and storage, then it puts us in a position where there's potential competition for land between that of biofuels and that of food. What of other temperature levels? I indicated in my introduction that actually choosing a level such as 2 degrees is incredibly difficult to do given the uncertainties. And what we found was, well, in this study, 2 degrees was the lowest we could achieve without negative emissions. We could get to 1.6 using the maximum capacity of negative emissions, still achieve a 50% probability. 1.5 degrees, well, we could get there, but with a lower probability, around 43% in this particular example. What about higher levels? Well, if we move across to a 2.5 degree temperature target, you can see the whole pattern of blobs in this blob plot have moved across. And now we're taking our example of a long-term reduction rate of 3% per year, is suggesting even without negative emissions, one could perhaps hold back on the peak to within the late 2020s. Going up to 3 degrees takes that further out still. But there's another side to looking at these higher temperature targets. And that's probably best illustrated by looking at this plot of cumulative probability of particular temperature levels. So the way to read this is looking along the line. This axis gives the probability of temperature being below the level on this axis. And we've been focusing on this 50% level. Well, the 2 degree pathway, that still gives a 10% chance of the warming exceeding 2.8 degrees. So there's a chance it's getting up there towards 3 degrees. But there's still greater than a 95% chance, actually greater than a 99% chance when you look closely at the diagram, of limiting global average warming below 4 degrees. Moving up to the 2.5 degree pathway, well, now the 10th percentile of the distribution, that's moved up to 3.5 degrees. And looking at the 3 degree pathway we looked at in the previous plots, well, the 10th percentile has now moved up to in excess of 4 degrees. And there's a 2% chance of warming actually reaching above the 5 degree level. Now, at these higher temperatures, although we can't say precisely when we will trigger large-scale changes in the climate system, there is a greater probability. Some work that Rachel led also brought in the aspect of avoided deforestation, and estimated with complete tropical deforestation, that could add something like 0.6 degrees to the warming during the 21st century. If we don't take account of deforestation when we come to looking at the emission reduction, then it means the amount of reduction one would have to carry out on the fossil fuel component would be much greater. Potentially the results we showed for 3% per year reduction rates may be pushed up as high as 6% per year reduction rates with continued deforestation. Just to summarise this section, so there are a range of different pathways that limit warming to 2 degrees with 50% probability, and these also avoid 4 degrees with a much higher probability, greater than 90%. Without negative emission sources, the window of limiting warming to 2 degrees with this probability is actually very narrow. 1.5 degrees, it can be achieved, but at either a lower probability or by allowing for some temporary overshoot of the temperature above the 1.5 degree level. Higher targets, they do allow later peaking, but at the price of the extreme estimates of warming being pushed to much higher levels. And continued deforestation will actually make it more difficult to achieve these targets. I put in a reminder at this point, because we have been focusing on global average temperature, don't forget about the regional changes. Remember the points I made earlier, that we need to take regional changes, extremes and tipping points into account when we look at this type of work. So now I'll hand over to Simon, who will talk about the economic and technical aspects of feasibility.
So just first to give you a bit of context in terms of, has that come through, in terms of what's observed fossil fuel emissions, CO2 fossil fuel emissions. And this is courtesy of Professor Corinne Le Quéré from University of East Anglia, and as part of the Global Carbon Project data set. And you know, we had in the 1990s just 1% per year increase in emissions. And then, of course, what's happened more recently, despite the little dip with the financial crisis, you know, we've got growth in CO2 emissions there, continuing at a rather rapid 3% per annum. And just to put that in the context of some of these SRES scenarios that have been mentioned before, the A scenarios, which you'll see at the top of that chart, are the more sort of rapid growth scenarios. The A1B we've heard about already is a sort of business as usual type scenario, and perhaps I'll also draw your attention to the A1F1, which is a fossil fuel FI, fossil intensive scenario. And you can see that the emissions are actually tracking those sort of higher emission scenarios, higher growth scenarios quite well. And just to give you a couple of points of reference as to where the IEA thinks we ought to be if we're on a 450 or broadly 2 degree scenario, you see those two stars coming down from the mid-30s of emissions down to 32, and then just over 22 in 2030, and then down very low obviously in 2050. So that's the sort of scale of the transformation that people are saying is consistent with a 50% chance of 2 degrees by the end of the century. Now, just a quick word to put some of this work in context. Energy systems modelling is an art, not a science, like Newtonian dynamics. You know, there are no irrefutable laws of motion for solid bodies rolling across a floor. You know, it provides directions, options, it gives you a framework for analysis, it gives you some high-level indications of emissions, what sort of technologies you can use at what cost, and so on. And what we see here on this chart is something which is not a void work. It's taken from the Stanford Energy Modelling Forum, where they do comparisons of lots of different energy models. And it's a very fascinating set of papers, actually. I recommend you looking at the Energy Economics Volume 31 of December 2009. It really is really good work. And they've taken a whole load of these energy models, which differ in many characteristics, and they've shown global CO2 emissions trajectories that are then consistent with this 450 CO2 scenario. And you'll see Some of them have a very rapid drop-off in emissions, and then they're pretty flat for the rest of the century. Some have emissions growing very rapidly, look at that blue line, and then falling off and actually going very negative here. And this is the sort of thing that Jason was talking about in terms of his BECS, his biomass with CCS technology, where you're actually getting negative emissions in the system. And the only reason that the blue line can go so high early on is they've got this big negative later on, which of course is a risky scenario if you never develop CCS, or you can't actually produce enough biomass to burn because you need it to produce food. So a range of different models. They differ because they assume that baseline emissions, if you like, the business as usual, will grow in different ways. They have different behaviour of the land sources and sinks of CO2, and they have different technology portfolios, and that's a big impact on the costs and feasibility of some of these emission scenarios. So let's move on to some avoid results, and for this I'm going to choose something that was done by the FEAM group using the so-called WITCH model, which is a hybrid model, and I'll explain what that is shortly. It's basically looking at different scenarios for emissions through this century. We specify in the scenario 3 things: a peak year for when the emissions start to come down, the rate at which they come down after that peak year, and the level they go to, either very low or pretty low. And the scenarios are labelled by S1 to 9 here. And you'll see this chart has 2 axes, as most of them do. On the bottom, you've got the temperature rise by the end of the century. And on the left-hand axis, you've got the net present value, discounted at 5%, of the GDP losses in their model from carrying out these mitigation scenarios. We're not putting in the climate damages here. It is just the mitigation costs. Now, you can see towards the left side of this chart the scenarios that get you to about 2 degrees. S1, S2, S3, S9. They cost more. You're having to make emissions reductions quite rapidly. Maybe you've got to actually destroy some of the dirty capital, replace it before its life expiry. Maybe there isn't enough time for the innovations, research and development to take place to reduce the cost of the technologies you're using, so it's expensive. And then as you come down the curve, you're getting to less and less challenging targets, and very much in the way that Jason saw more scope for achieving these targets. Here we see less cost for achieving these targets, but clearly they have a high risk of going to even higher levels of the temperature at the end of the century. And then S7 is at the end there. You see a 3-degree rise by the end of the century. Now, what is worth pointing out here is that, you know, the costs actually depend on timing. So if you look at, say, the difference between S1 and S2, that's a couple of years of delay, and S2 is a faster rate of decline, so it costs more. And sometimes, if you delay too long, you can't even make the target, even if you reduce emissions at, say, 5%. That's why there's no S4 on this chart. That scenario, which delayed for another 10 years, but then made rapid reductions, just wasn't feasible. So you couldn't deliver a 2-degree world with that. The technologies that were used in this model, quite a wide range, but no BECS actually, and that too might bias the costs upwards. And energy demand reductions were needed to achieve this. So just make one further point. This is just one model. This is the WITCH model. There are a whole spectrum of models that have been used in this sort of modelling, and not all of them can achieve a 2-degree target of 450 forcing generally in terms of CO2 equivalent. So this leads me to conclude that things like CCS, things like the negative emissions, are actually quite crucial to the feasibility of achieving something like 2 degrees. And just from that WITCH model, you see a technology mix of the contributions to the mitigation effort. Here we have cumulative energy on the left-hand side in exajoules, the different scenarios along the bottom. And you see the light blue at the bottom is energy consumption reduction. Effectively, energy efficiency measures, some loss of consumption as well, because in this model, it's very difficult to decarbonise the transport sector, and therefore you have to cut back on some other activity to do that, to make the emissions reductions required. Reasonably big role for nuclear, this was before Fukushima. Coal with CCS, and then renewables and advanced fuels, making a big contribution. Now, I don't want to dwell on this anymore, I'm conscious of the time, so let's move on to looking at the broader political context of these changes. This is a slide from the International Energy Agency, their WEA in 2011, which was a rather nice portrayal of who's been responsible for the emissions so far, which is the dark purple lines there, with a nice label of the country and the amount of gigatons of CO2 emitted over the last century and a bit. And then in the sort of tasteful lilac, what's going to happen over the next 25 years on IEA projections. And you'll see that vast change in the structure of the world economy reflected in the Chinese, Indian emissions relative to what they were over the whole of the last century. And the first four of those groups, US, China, European Union, India, they're going to continue to be responsible for about 60% of the world's CO2 emissions. So some of the work we carried out in the Avoid programme actually dug into the nitty-gritty of the Chinese and Indian energy systems and their emission trajectories. And this is some work that we did actually with IASA, which is the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, using their message energy model. Now, this is a very technology-rich model, very flexible. It was that, if you remember that illustration with lots of different models, it was the blue line that went up very high and then came down and had lots of negative emissions. So there's lots of technologies in there. It's a very rich model. And therefore, you know, it ends up being able to model a shift in Chinese emissions from a baseline on the left-hand side there of just over 10 gigatons of CO2 right through to this low-carbon scenario here, which is just under 3 gigatons of CO2 by 2050. That's a huge change. It's a huge transformation in what China could be able to do based on this model. And the emissions are largely in three sectors. We've grouped them here for analytical purposes as industry, transport and building savings. I'll show you the electricity supply system in a minute. And you see the range of measures that go into contributing to this. And it's a whole range of things. You have to do a lot of different things. Fuel switching, CCS in the iron and steel industry, energy efficiency, decarbonising electricity, huge contribution there in that industry savings block, the second column in from the left. So those are all the savings that you subtract from that baseline. Next, transport savings, somewhat smaller, but again, modal shift, biofuels, electric vehicles, all these things make a contribution. And then finally in the buildings area where decarbonised electricity, low carbon, heating and energy efficiency make contributions. And then you end up with this 2.8. Now, the costs for that are quite modest. 2% of GDP annually by 2050 was the estimate. You might ask, well, why don't we do it? Maybe it's that the figure's robust, maybe not. I mean, the model, you know, is giving lower costs for that sort of mitigation than the Which model we saw earlier. Depends on the characteristics of the model. And, you know, we don't yet know which is perhaps the more accurate estimate. This has got a lot of potential to adjust. The Which model has a lot more inertia in terms of the technology change, and a lot more investment is required to make some of those changes. So we're seeing two illustrations there of different models and how the results can differ. But it's interesting to look at the electricity generation pattern that then suggests might be optimal in China if they were going to achieve this sort of low carbon outcome. And you see on the left again the baseline, this huge black column of coal generation with just a little bit of other things, largely hydro. And then in the abatement scenario, you know, how that's transformed. And again, note also how it depends on, in this case, getting CCS working at scale in time, because these are making huge contributions to the emissions reduction, as well as solar PV, nuclear, wind, and so on. Finally, just one slide on India. We've done a similar thing for the electricity system, which we can show you later if you're interested, but I don't want to take up more time. But again, here, you can move from a reference case, which is the upper line with the rather sort of pastel colours of 8 gigatons of CO2 emitted by 2050, reflecting a rapid growth in Indian economic activity and the fossil fuel intensity of their systems. But you can get down to something more like 2.4 gigatons within the message. Sorry, this is the UCL model, the Mark-Altayan model, down to 2.4 gigatons of CO2 by 2050. And again, the mitigation costs vary depending on the technologies you've got available. There's a lower range of perhaps 1.2% of GDP by 2050 if you have CCS available. If you don't have CCS available, you end up putting a lot more money into solar and into advanced vehicles, and that's a more costly option, but you can still reach the same target with about 2.5% of GDP. And then just moving on quickly to conclude, we've seen that CO2 emissions are growing still very rapidly. We've also heard from Jason that a 2 degrees target with 50% probability requires an early peaking and sustained reductions. And we've seen that energy models differ very much on feasibility and on their costs, and the costs are not negligible. These are significant fractions of GDP. And I think what we should sort of take from some of this rich modelling literature is that the technological and economic feasibility is going to be increased by early and broadly based international mitigation action, including the major developing economies. Limiting growth in energy demand through really targeted, focused efforts on energy efficiency in industry and buildings, in transport and so on. And really making sure we have the portfolio of technologies we need to deliver these emissions reductions. And some of those technologies we have already, and some still require a lot of RD&D, research, development, demonstration, like CCS, very advanced vehicles and fuels, and energy storage is a core one. Highlight again this critical dependence on negative emissions, whether you have it or you haven't, makes a huge difference in terms of the policy trajectory you think you should and could follow. And what we haven't talked about here, and there hasn't been time, is non-CO2 greenhouse gases, which are an important part of the story as well, but they'll have to be a story for another day, I'm afraid. So I'll leave it there.
So looking across all of the presentations, we've seen from Nigel and Rachel just how big the impacts might be in a world that reaches the order of 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And the numbers were uncertain, but they were large. They also showed that the benefits of mitigation can be quantified. When looking at the proportion of impacts avoided, actually the numbers become more robust when expressed in that way. They also showed that for those impacts that you can't avoid, that you might be buying extra time to adapt. I think that's a critical result that's come out of the study of the impacts part of the project. When looking at these lower temperature targets, well, we've seen there are pathways that limit warming to 2 degrees, but either very early peaking or the introduction of negative emissions might be needed. And from a technological and economic point of view, it represents a real challenge to get to a level such as 2 degrees. Homing in on the national level, well, it does depend on the global context, but Simon showed 2 examples of credible low-carbon transition pathways for India and China that really got down to the level of individual technologies. Now, I think it's absolutely vital to say that this subject has moved on quite a bit over the past 5 years, but there's still a lot of further work required. There's work required in the underpinning climate science. We need to get a better handle on extremes. We need to get a better handle on rainfall changes. We need to really understand some of the extra biogeochemical feedbacks in the system, like permafrost and marine hydrates. There are also big gaps in the impact science, the economic analysis and the technical options. The questions are probably a good point to explore those in a bit more detail. Just before we move to questions, I want to say a big thank you to everybody who has contributed to Avoid Research. And I don't really expect you to be able to read all the names on that, but if you squint hard enough and you've contributed, you might be able to see your own name up there. And so thank you to everyone who's really taken part in the programme. And at that point, I'll put this back up and perhaps we can go to questions.
Hi there. Nick Maybe from E3G. Running a panel later, but I thought this is a question. It was really interesting, though. I mean, sometimes some of the uncertainties you're showing look less to me, certainly climate sensitivity, and some of the other models I'm not qualified as a non-climate scientist to judge. And sitting here saying, okay, if I had to add up all these uncertainties, both about the science and the scenarios and the ability to limit emissions, and particularly tipping points, to say what would be a sensible place to aim at and in making a judgment call over all those scenarios, saying 2 degrees hadn't been decided. Just, how would I pull that together as advice for a decision maker? Because that's what we've got to do. And just, as we don't all own this, what would you recommend to Ban Ki-moon, this is a good example, as the right, safe risk management, global average temperatures, we're using that as a metric to aim for, taking into account all the uncertainties and the tipping points, not just the ones you can quantify, given the fact you've just gone through this huge, enormous exercise and therefore have this all in your forebrain. Personal answers, not organisational answers.
I think Nigel wants to take this first.
Okay, well, this issue of uncertainty is one that's sort of troubled us all the way through. And if you do present probability distributions left, right, and centre, it all looks more uncertain than it really is, because in many senses, a lot of these uncertainties are actually linked. And what we found quite helpful has been trying to present a plausible, coherent story as a sort of central case, which is why we showed some of the impacts and so on from one model, without saying this is what's going to happen, but saying if you present that as a plausible, coherent story, it emphasises the linkages between sectors and places, and then say, well, actually, that's a coherent story. If you want to avoid that, then these are what happens if you do that. And then look at the uncertainty associated with the precise numbers. But you need to start off with a story, I think, and then add the uncertainty, rather than start off with the uncertainty and the probability distributions. And that's what we found has been quite helpful.
Yeah, I'll take a little bit on that as well. I mean, there are uncertainties and there are uncertainties. And climate science has got a lot better at quantifying some of them. So when it comes, for instance, to looking at the probability of particular temperature levels, there we can combine the things we've learned on the distribution of climate sensitivity, on ocean heat uptake, etc. So in those cases, it's very much a case for really taking that risk-based information into account. I think the challenge that you threw to us in the question is, especially over the large-scale changes, the abrupt change, the non-linearities in the climate system. As I said in my introduction, I think we've learned more about the physical processes, and we can perhaps do a better job now at understanding the impacts associated with those tipping points and look for no regrets adaptation options. But we are really still a long way from understanding the probability of triggering those sorts of events. And so given that, what can we fall back on? Well, we can fall back on observations. We can use the sort of techniques associated with attribution to start to try to understand the risk of changes that we're already seeing in the climate. And we can look at other evidence strands. So one thing we did in a previous project when we were faced with constructing sea level scenarios for the Thames Barrier was to say, well, actually, we know the models can't get an upper estimate of sea level, but let's see what information we can pull in from looking at paleoclimate and looking at physical constraints. So what if all of the outlet glaciers on the West Antarctic ice sheet went as fast as we'd ever seen any glacier go? by pulling these different information strands together, I think you can build up certainly a richer picture, but it doesn't get all the way to understanding the tipping points at the moment.
Thank you. Jim Watson, UK Energy Research Centre. My question follows on from Nick's, really. Last week, I and maybe some others in the room saw Fatih Birol of the IEA presenting the World Energy Outlook 2012. One thing that I took away from what he said was he's surprised how many people he meets when he presents this that thinks 4 degrees is okay, something they can live with, as it were. And it really struck him. Now, from what I've seen from what you've presented, 4 degrees definitely isn't okay for many people, communities, species, etc. What can the panel do to get that message across, that actually, you know, the difference not only between mitigating 2 degrees, 2.5 are quite big, but the 4, which is now your business as usual, is much worse. You know, so there are, you know, big differences between the impacts. I mean, you've displayed it to all of us, but how do you get that out in the more general discourse?
I'm not sure who's going to answer that question.
Yeah, just following on from the previous speaker and your question, I mean, I think we've shown that there already are very significant impacts at only 2 degrees, and that, you know, particularly the analysis on natural ecosystems is really showing that that's an extremely challenging, even 2 degrees is very challenging for natural ecosystems. And also for some of the human systems, the impacts are also very significant. Now, as we've said, we've focused in this presentation on what percentage of those impacts we can avoid rather than the size of those impacts. But nevertheless, we have been talking about very large numbers. Now, the other issue that is relevant here is there's a set of international model comparisons going on at the moment. Comparing across all sorts of different impact models across the world to try to get a more consistent picture out of our understanding of estimates of impacts. And I think that's going to lead to some press releases and headline messages coming out fairly soon, which essentially the climate science work, there's been international model comparisons going on for a long, long time, and that's just now beginning to happen in the impacts world. And the work that we're doing in Avoid is one piece of that on the impact side.
I think some of the extreme weather that's happened recently is a really good way of getting over to people the risks of, I'm not sure this is on, can you hear? Yeah, the extreme weather that's happened recently, you know, in itself is a good way of displaying, you know, the major risks that you run in playing with this system anymore. So I think, you know, you illustrate what you know, you try to extrapolate as far as you can with confidence from models, but I don't think any of us could really paint an authentic picture of what 4 degree world is. It's going to be very different in terms of climate, in terms of weather. Brian Hoskins always reminds me it's going to be different in terms of weather because the circulation will change as the climate changes. So, you know, it's not easy to paint that picture, but what you can do is look at the regional patterns, say in temperature, which are perhaps more robust, and think that, you know, we're not talking about a global mean temperature, we're talking about regional temperatures that, you know, are maybe 2 or 3 times as large in the poles, in the high latitudes, very much higher in the continental regions, and then you talk to people about, well, what does that mean for your agriculture? What does that mean for your water supply? And then they start thinking. And you have to engage with people in a conversation, I think, at that point to understand what does that mean for you? How would you cope with this? And then maybe you get this sort of realization, but it's a long process.
Okay, another question back there.
Yeah, Bob Ward from the Grantham Research Institute at LSE. It relates to that last question, and I wanted to pick up on the comments from Rachel. Nick Stern now points out that one of the major problems of communicating with policymakers is the use of economic models which produce very low apparent estimates of the economic costs of unmanaged climate change. And you mentioned that some of the models around are saying 3 degrees could be optimal. It's quite clear when you look at those models that they fail to capture a lot of the major impacts. For instance, they fail to capture the possibility of large-scale migration of large numbers of people and the potential for conflict, and that's completely not covered. So I was wondering to what extent you felt we were getting to a place where those economic models were really starting to represent the true scale of potential impacts, because at the moment they seem to be actually a hindrance to communicating to policymakers.
Well, at the moment, none of the models can capture that kind of detail. The PAGE model is one of the few models that includes the risks from what it calls large-scale discontinuities, which is actually the tipping points that Jason was talking about. And it is very firmly rooted in the literature, but its representation of impacts is still quite simple. It's market impacts and non-market impacts. And recently there are a number of research proposals being written to try to make a bridge between the kinds of impacts modelling that we've been presenting today and economic models like PAGE, to try to find a way of actually calculating the physical damages and then estimating their direct effects on the economy in a process-based fashion. So I do think that a lot of progress can be made in that respect, but I still think that it may be an insurmountable challenge to ever incorporate every possible impact, because even if you try and do that physically, all of these impacts interact. We haven't even started to look at that yet. So the impacts on ecosystems are going to have implications for all of the impacts that Nigel presented in the other sectors. And then that in turn is going to interact with our land use planning. And so it's an immense challenge, but I do think there's much that can be done to improve that approach.
John Bennington.
Yeah, I get really uneasy when you push things out in the time so far to the right. I can't get very excited about 2050. Christ, I'll be 105. 2080, is sort of beyond belief. And I really think that you lose your impact by pointing to things like the end of the century, 2070, 2080. They're correct, but they are massively uncertain. And therefore, I do wonder whether there's not some sense in actually thinking almost sort of on a decadal time path of what the impacts are likely to be. So if you are on a trajectory for 4 degrees, what is the decadal time path? What's it going to look like between now and 2020? What's it going to look like between 2020 and 2030? These are the sort of things that actually do have a potential for impacting. Now, obviously, the political cycle is going 2 whole years to 2015 at the moment, but it might arguably go a little bit longer. But I think you have really got to ponder, and I think Nick Stern's point is interesting, but actually I think it misses the point. I think the key is you need to be thinking not about what the effect on GDP is, whether you've added in migration or whatever. I think you've got to actually ask about what the cumulative effects of the damage is going to be over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, because they're the ones that are going to have the impact. And I think that there's a real danger in trying to get spurious accuracy about economic effects many decades into the future, because actually, straight answer is don't know. That's not a question, it's pontification.
Well, I think maybe we could have Jason not get too many microphones. Jason, just wrap up on that, then we'll close this session. We'll have more discussion later on.
I mean, just picking up a quick point on that, I think having nearer term projections is absolutely essential when it comes to planning for resilience and adaptation. When it comes to the mitigation question, there's almost a contradiction when you look at some of the plots. On one hand, you're seeing the need to take mitigation action in the next decade if you want to get to the lower temperatures, but you're not seeing the benefit of those, certainly not on a local scale, until perhaps 3 or 4 decades ahead. And what this does to me, it gets away from this artificial separation between the mitigation debate and the adaptation debate, because they're two sides of the same coin, and you have to start thinking of them starting from today forward.